On the morning of December 8, 1941, Tokyo time, cheers erupted across the Japanese Empire. The news spread like wildfire. The Imperial Navy had struck Pearl Harbor, crippling America's Pacific Fleet in a single blow. Radio broadcasts played triumphant marches, newspapers printed bold headlines, and crowds filled the streets waving flags. At last, the rising sun seemed unstoppable. For Japanese leaders, the mood was just as jubilant. Admirals boasted that America had been caught off guard, its battleships smoldering, its pride shattered. General Hideki Tojo spoke confidently of a new order in Asia, declaring that Japan's spiritual strength and discipline had triumphed over American decadence. Officers toasted victory, certain that their enemy was too soft, too distracted, and too weak to recover. At first glance, it seemed they were right. America in 1941 did not look like a nation ready for global war. Its army was small compared to Europe's great powers, its navy battered, and its people still shaken by the Depression. To many in Tokyo, America appeared as nothing more than a giant with feet of clay. Yes, it had factories, but factories alone did not win wars, spirit and sacrifice did. And Japan believed it had both in abundance. But within months, unsettling whispers began to filter through intelligence channels. Reports from spies and diplomats suggested that America was not paralyzed, it was mobilizing. Auto plants in Detroit were shutting down car production and retooling for aircraft. Boeing and Douglas were expanding. Entire assembly lines were being rebuilt in record time. The numbers being floated were unbelievable. Tens of thousands of planes planned for 1942, more the year after. At first, Japanese officers laughed. How could a nation that had just lost its battleships possibly build an air force out of thin air? Propaganda back home assured the public that Americans were lazy, wasteful, and cowardly. No amount of machines could match the spirit of the Japanese warrior, the skill of the Zero fighter pilot, or the courage of those willing to die for the emperor. And yet, the reports kept coming. By mid-1942, American factories were already producing aircraft at a pace Japan could scarcely comprehend. For every Zero Japan lost in combat, America could build several new fighters. For every bomber shot down, 2 more rolled off the assembly line. The whispers turned into a roar. America was not simply rebuilding. It was unleashing something the world had never seen before. By 1943, the truth was undeniable. America was on track to build nearly 100,000 planes in a single year, more than Japan's entire fleet several times over. To Tokyo's stunned leadership, the realization was like a thunderclap. This was not the America they had mocked. This was an America transformed into an arsenal, where every factory, every worker, and every assembly line was a weapon of war. The day Japan learned America could build 100,000 planes in a year was not marked by explosions or battles. It was marked by the silent shock of numbers, statistics so vast they seemed impossible. It was the moment when Japan's leaders understood, though few would admit it aloud, that they had awakened a giant not only in spirit but also in steel. The central question loomed like a shadow. How could a nation dismissed as weak suddenly summon the power to flood the skies with more planes than the Axis could ever hope to match? The answer lay not just in courage or strategy, but in industry itself. In the coming chapters, we will uncover how America turned its factories into weapons, how its people embraced the role of the arsenal of democracy, and why those 100,000 planes were more than machines. They were symbols of a new kind of warfare. In the early months of 1942, Japan's empire stretched wider than at any point in its history. From Manchuria in the north to the jungles of Malaya in the south, from the islands of the Philippines to the gates of Burma, the rising sun flag flew over vast swaths of Asia and the Pacific. It was a triumph of daring strategy and disciplined execution. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been followed by one stunning victory after another. British battleships were sunk. American outposts fell in rapid succession. Japan's Zero fighters ruled the skies. To many observers, it seemed as if Japan had achieved the impossible. It had toppled Western dominance in Asia. Behind this momentum was a deeply held belief. Japan's leaders were convinced that their warriors, steeped in the code of Bushido, possessed a spiritual strength that decadent Western societies could never match. They saw America as a land of materialists, softened by comfort, divided by politics, and too individualistic to endure the sacrifices of war. Courage, sacrifice, and unity, Tokyo believed, would defeat factories and machines. At Pearl Harbor, this belief seemed vindicated. The United States, shocked and humiliated, appeared to be reeling. Newspapers in Japan declared that the sleeping giant had been struck down before it could rise. Generals and admirals assumed that Washington, faced with the enormous task of rebuilding, would sue for peace rather than wage a long war across oceans. Time, they believed, was on Japan's side. Yet beneath the surface, another story was unfolding. In Washington and across the American heartland, leaders had been preparing for this moment long before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. As early as 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had warned that the world was sliding into darkness. In his famous Arsenal of Democracy speech, he declared that America would become the great supplier of weapons for all those resisting aggression. At the time, the words seemed bold, even unrealistic. The U.S. Army was smaller than Portugal's. Its navy, though formidable, was stretched thin. Its air force barely existed. But Roosevelt's vision was rooted not in current strength, but in potential, the untapped capacity of America's industrial machine. That potential was immense. The United States possessed resources unmatched by any other nation, vast reserves of steel, oil, coal, and aluminum. Its factories, though still focused on civilian goods in 1940, were modern and flexible. Its workforce was large, disciplined, and increasingly skilled. And its geography provided a shield: two oceans to the east and west, and friendly neighbors to the north and south. While Europe and Asia were already consumed by war, America had time and space to prepare. Even before Pearl Harbor, the gears of mobilization were turning. Auto companies in Detroit began experimenting with bomber production. Shipyards expanded dry docks and assembly slips. Airplane manufacturers like Boeing, Douglas, and Grumman received government contracts that multiplied by the month. Civilian industries were quietly asked to prepare for conversion. When war finally came, the foundation was already in place. This was the great miscalculation of Japan. Tokyo had measured America's strength by the number of ships at Pearl Harbor or the size of its pre-war army. It had underestimated the factories, the assembly lines, and the industrial willpower that could be unleashed once the nation was united in war. By the end of 1942, Japan would begin to sense its error. By 1943, the numbers were staggering. And by 1944, when the United States produced nearly 100,000 aircraft in a single year, the illusion of American weakness was shattered forever. For Japan, this was more than a strategic setback. It was a psychological blow, a realization that courage alone could not defeat machinery on such a scale. The warrior spirit might win battles, but industry would decide the war. And so the question grew sharper with every passing month. Could Japan's empire, built on daring strikes and faith in spirit, survive against an enemy whose true weapon was not the battleship or the bomber, but the factory itself? In December 1941, Japan had rolled the dice with a gamble of historic proportions. The strike on Pearl Harbor was bold, devastating, and brilliantly executed. Yet it was not, as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself had warned, the end of America's military power. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant," Yamamoto was reported to have said. Whether the words were apocryphal or not, they captured his understanding of America better than most of his contemporaries in Tokyo. Yamamoto had studied in the United States, knew its culture, and had seen its industries firsthand. He recognized that America was not weak, merely unready, and once roused, it possessed resources Japan could not hope to match. But Yamamoto's cautionary voice was drowned out by the optimism of men like Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and other members of the Japanese High Command. They believed that the Pearl Harbor blow had bought Japan the time it needed. 6 months, perhaps a year, long enough to secure its new empire, fortify defensive lines, and present America with a fait accompli. By then, Tokyo hoped, the United States would find the cost of reconquest too high and accept peace on Japanese terms. The strategy depended on speed, audacity, and the assumption that America's willpower would falter. In the early months, the plan seemed to work. Japanese forces surged across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, conquering vast territories in rapid succession. The Philippines fell, Singapore surrendered, and Malaya and Burma were overrun. In battle after battle, Japanese pilots flying the Mitsubishi A6M0 dominated the skies. Western forces, caught off guard and ill-prepared, crumbled before the seemingly unstoppable advance. To Japanese soldiers and civilians alike, the victories confirmed what propaganda had long insisted, that Japan's spirit, discipline, and sacrifice gave it an edge over the materialist West. Newspapers declared that the Americans were soft, incapable of enduring hardship, and bound to collapse under pressure. Pamphlets compared the Zero fighters' agility and range to the clumsy, outmatched aircraft of the United States. For every Japanese victory, the myth of American weakness grew stronger. And yet, behind the triumphs, hints of trouble were already emerging. Even as Japanese officers celebrated their victories, reports began trickling in from the intelligence services. American factories, they said, were mobilizing at a speed no one in Tokyo had expected. Shipyards on the West Coast were laying keels for new carriers and destroyers at a furious pace. Airplane manufacturers in California and Seattle had expanded shifts to run around the clock. In Detroit, assembly lines that once produced shiny new automobiles were now turning out engines and aircraft parts. Tojo and his staff dismissed many of these reports as exaggerations, perhaps even deliberate disinformation. After all, how could a nation that had just been struck such a devastating blow recover so quickly? Yet Yamamoto and others who had seen America firsthand urged caution. They reminded Tokyo that the United States possessed immense natural resources, steel, oil, coal, and aluminum in quantities that dwarfed Japan's reserves. Unlike the island empire of Japan, America did not need to seize resources abroad. It already had them in abundance. On the battlefield, the cracks began to show. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 and the Battle of Midway just a month later, Japanese forces were confronted not by a crippled navy, but by a resurgent one. Carriers Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet proved that Pearl Harbor had not eliminated America's striking power. The loss of 4 Japanese carriers at Midway stunned Tokyo. More troubling still was how quickly the Americans seemed to recover from their own losses. Yorktown, badly damaged at Coral Sea, had returned to fight at Midway in mere weeks. The Japanese, by contrast, struggled to repair or replace ships in time. This contrast hinted at something deeper. American industry was not only large, but also flexible. It could repair, rebuild, and replace equipment at a pace Japan could not match. In Tokyo, intelligence officers began to sound the alarm. If the current trends continued, they warned, America would soon outproduce Japan many times over. Captured reports and prisoner interrogations added to the unease. German officers stationed in Japan shared their own concerns. They had seen American production numbers in Europe and recognized the danger. Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, was astonished by U.S. output, later admitting that Germany had been outbuilt from the start. Japanese officers, steeped in the Bushido mindset of spirit over steel, found it difficult to grasp the full implications. Still, the numbers were undeniable. By the end of 1942, American aircraft production had already reached nearly 50,000 planes, more than Japan had produced in the entire war up to that point. And the pace was accelerating. Rumors spread that Detroit's new Willow Run factory could turn out bombers by the hour. Reports spoke of women in coveralls working on assembly lines and African Americans and immigrants joining the war effort in industries once closed to them. Entire cities were being reshaped into engines of war. For Japanese pilots, the change was felt firsthand. In the skies over Guadalcanal and New Guinea, they began to encounter not just a handful of American planes, but swarms of them. For every Zero shot down, it seemed 2 more appeared. Pilots wrote home of battles where their squadrons were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. One veteran confessed, "We fought bravely, but there were always more of them. Always more." The shock was gradual but profound. Japan had gambled that America's spirit was weak, that its people would not endure a long war. Instead, the war was revealing something very different. A nation capable of combining determination with industrial power on a scale the world had never seen. Tokyo's leaders faced a stark reality. Their strategy had been built on the belief that time was their ally. But with each passing month, time was turning against them. The factories of America were not just producing machines, they were producing inevitability. By 1943, the transformation of the United States into a war machine was complete. What had once been an economy of automobiles, radios, and refrigerators now roared with the sound of aircraft engines, rivet guns, and conveyor belts carrying the parts of war. Factories across the nation had been converted, expanded, or newly built, creating an industrial network unlike anything the world had ever seen. President Roosevelt had promised in 1940 that America would become the arsenal of democracy. At the time, even his closest advisors struggled to imagine what that would look like. But within 3 years, the phrase was no longer rhetoric. It was visible in the skies, the shipyards, and the assembly lines stretching across the continent. Nowhere was this more dramatic than in Detroit. Once the proud capital of the automobile, Detroit became the capital of American aircraft production. The Ford Motor Company, famous for its assembly line revolution in the 1920s, now applied that same genius to the B-24 Liberator bomber. At Willow Run, a sprawling new factory outside the city, Ford workers turned out these massive 4-engine planes with assembly line precision. By 1944, one B-24 was rolling off the line every 63 minutes. For Japanese intelligence, the news was staggering. The B-24 was not a small fighter. It was one of the heaviest bombers of the war, capable of carrying thousands of pounds of explosives across vast distances. To imagine them being produced not by the dozen, but by the hour, was beyond comprehension. One Japanese officer later remarked in disbelief, "We calculated their production as if they were human. We did not understand that their machines could work as soldiers too." And Willow Run was only one factory. Boeing's plants in Seattle churned out B-17 Flying Fortresses, the rugged workhorse of America's daylight bombing campaigns. Douglas Aircraft in California expanded at a furious pace, producing bombers, transports, and fighters. Grumman, Lockheed, and North American Aviation filled hangars with new designs: the F-6F Hellcat, the P-38 Lightning, and the P-51 Mustang. Each of these aircraft would play decisive roles in the battles to come. The scale was breathtaking. In 1942 alone, the United States produced around 48,000 aircraft. By 1943, that number leapt to 85,000. In 1944, it reached nearly 100,000. Japan, by contrast, produced fewer than 28,000 planes that year, many of them outdated or poorly equipped. For every zero that Japan lost in combat, America could replace it 10 times over. But it wasn't just numbers. American innovation also surged. Radar-equipped night fighters, long-range escort planes, and high-altitude bombers expanded the battlefield in ways the Axis had not foreseen. Japan's vaunted Zero, once dominant, suddenly found itself outclassed by swarms of Hellcats and Mustangs. This miracle of production did not come easily. It required the mobilization of millions. Men went off to war, and women filled the factories in their place. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of this new workforce, where women drilled, welded, riveted, and assembled machines of war. African American workers, long excluded from many industries, gained opportunities through the pressures of mobilization and the activism of leaders like A. Philip Randolph. Immigrants and farmers' sons alike poured into the cities to join the industrial army. The effort extended beyond labor. The U.S. government orchestrated the largest logistical and financial mobilization in history. War bonds financed expansion. Rationing ensured that resources went first to the front. Railroads ran day and night, shipping steel, aluminum, and engines from coast to coast. The nation became a single organism with one purpose: to build. For the Japanese, facing shortages of oil, aluminum, and steel, the contrast was devastating. By 1943, their factories were already straining under Allied bombing and resource scarcity. Production was fragmented, often carried out in small workshops vulnerable to disruption. Skilled labor was limited, and Japan had little capacity to replace it as the war dragged on. Meanwhile, American planes flooded every front. In North Africa, waves of P-40s and B-25s hammered German and Italian forces. In Europe, thousands of bombers darkened the skies over Germany, escorted by sleek P-51 Mustangs with the range to strike deep into the Reich. And in the Pacific, carrier decks groaned under the weight of squadrons of fighters and dive bombers, ready to strike any island fortress Japan had built. Japanese pilots began to feel the difference firsthand. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, later dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, U.S. pilots and anti-aircraft gunners destroyed nearly 500 Japanese aircraft in a single day. It was a massacre, and it revealed the cold reality. Japan could not replace its losses. America could. Captured Japanese officers were stunned when interrogators shared production figures. One recalled hearing that the United States had built nearly 100,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. We thought it was a trick. We thought they were lying to break our morale. But then we saw the skies fill with bombers, and we knew it was true. Even Germany, Japan's ally, expressed disbelief. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later admitted that Germany had underestimated American output from the beginning. "We could not comprehend it," he wrote. "The Americans were producing more aircraft than all of us combined, and they were doing it while still building automobiles and refrigerators." For Japan, the shock was not just military, it was psychological. The empire had gambled on spirit, courage, and discipline, but the Americans had revealed a different kind of strength: the power of scale, the might of machines, and the inexhaustible capacity to produce. And in modern war, that was the strength that mattered most. By late 1943, Japan's leaders could no longer ignore what was unfolding. The empire that had stunned the world with its audacity was now beginning to feel the crushing weight of American industry. The United States was not merely matching Japan, it was burying it beneath waves of steel, aluminum, and roaring aircraft engines. The most immediate consequence was material. Japan's industrial system had always been fragile. Unlike the resource-rich United States, Japan lacked essential raw materials. Its oil came from conquered territories in Southeast Asia, vulnerable to blockade and bombing. Its steel and aluminum were limited, often of poor quality. By 1943, Allied submarines were slicing through Japanese shipping lanes, sinking tankers and freighters faster than they could be replaced. Entire factories ground to a halt for lack of fuel or raw materials. The aircraft industry was among the hardest hit. Early in the war, Japan had produced fighters like the Zero that outclassed anything the Allies could field. But by 1943, those designs were aging, and efforts to replace them faltered. The Mitsubishi J2M Raiden and the Nakajima Ki-84 Frank showed promise, but production was slow, engines unreliable, and materials scarce. Pilots often found themselves flying aircraft built with wooden frames or lacking sufficient armor and radios. By contrast, American pilots were climbing into sleek, modern planes equipped with advanced technology, long-range fuel tanks, and powerful weapons. The disparity only grew more obvious in battle. In the skies over the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific, Japanese pilots confronted swarms of American planes. They were not just outnumbered, they were outclassed. P-38 Lightnings and F-6F Hellcats shredded Zeros with superior speed, firepower, and protection. Where Japanese aircraft had once danced gracefully in the skies, they now burned in droves, falling into the sea like sparks from a dying fire. The psychological effect on Japanese airmen was devastating. Many were veterans of the early war, accustomed to dominance. Now, they were watching their comrades die faster than replacements could arrive. Letters home spoke of despair. "We fight bravely, but there are always more of them. Always more." The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 was the clearest expression of this industrial imbalance. Nearly 500 Japanese planes were destroyed in a single day. American pilots joked grimly, calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But for Japan, it was no joke. It was the collapse of its air arm. The Imperial Navy's carrier force, once the terror of the Pacific, was left defenseless. Japan could not replace its pilots or its planes. America could, and did. For the Japanese leadership, the reports were sobering. Intelligence officers brought back figures of American aircraft production that seemed impossible. When told that the United States had built nearly 100,000 planes in 1944 alone, some dismissed it as propaganda. But the skies told the truth. Over Tokyo, swarms of B-29 superfortresses blackened the horizon. Over Iwo Jima and Okinawa, waves of carrier-based aircraft descended like a storm. The numbers could no longer be denied. Captured Japanese officers later recalled the shock. One described seeing hundreds of bombers overhead. "We thought perhaps the Americans had sent everything they had. Then we learned this was only a fraction of their power." Another PO confessed, "We had believed our spirit would overcome their machines. But their machines never ended. It was like fighting the ocean itself." The shock was not limited to Japan. Germany, too, felt the weight of American industry. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, marveled at U.S. output. "It was beyond anything we could imagine," he later admitted. While we fought for survival, the Americans produced not only weapons, but also consumer goods for their people. Their abundance was terrifying. For Japan, the consequences were catastrophic. Without air cover, its fleets became easy prey. At Leyte Gulf in late 1944, American planes swarmed Japanese battleships and carriers, sinking them with brutal efficiency. On land, U.S. bombers devastated industrial centers, reducing entire cities to ash. The famed B-29 raids on Tokyo in 1945 incinerated over 100,000 people in a single night, destroying Japan's ability to wage war at home. The industrial disparity also eroded morale among civilians. Japanese families, already suffering from shortages, listened to radio broadcasts about America's endless production with disbelief and dread. In the face of rationing and hunger, the thought of an enemy that could build 100,000 planes in a year was unbearable. By 1945, many in Japan's high command privately acknowledged the war could not be won. Admiral Yamamoto's warning had come true. The sleeping giant had not only awakened, it had harnessed its vast industrial might in a way no one in Tokyo had foreseen. The Japanese bet on courage and surprise. America bet on factories and machines. And the machines were winning. It was the summer of 1944, and the skies over the Pacific told a story more powerful than any statistic. Japanese officers, once so confident in their Zero squadrons and carrier fleets, now stood helpless as waves of American planes darkened the horizon. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had already annihilated hundreds of Japanese aircraft. But it was not the battle itself that broke morale, it was what the battle revealed. On June 19th, Japanese pilots took off in desperate numbers, hoping to halt the U.S. invasion of the Marianas. What they found instead was an ocean of Hellcats, Avengers, and Corsairs, guided by radar, coordinated with precision, and backed by carriers that seemed endless. One Japanese survivor remembered the moment vividly. "We thought we were facing all of America's strength. Then we realized this was only part of it. The rest waited over the horizon." From the decks of American carriers, pilots joked grimly as they returned from sorties. They called it the Turkey Shoot because Japanese planes fell so easily, so predictably, they seemed like birds in a hunt. But in Tokyo, the news was devastating. Hundreds of irreplaceable planes and pilots had been lost in a single day. The Imperial Navy's once proud air arm was shattered. And then, as if to drive the point home, came the bombers. In the fall of 1944, American B-29 superfortresses began appearing in the skies over Japan itself. At first, they came in dozens, then in hundreds. Their long silver bodies glistened in the sun as they flew at altitudes unreachable by most Japanese fighters. They dropped bombs on factories, railways, and cities. The ground shook, flames consumed neighborhoods, and the Japanese people stared upward in disbelief. For the officers watching, the numbers were staggering. They had been told America might produce tens of thousands of planes. But now they could see it with their own eyes. Fleets so vast that even if dozens were shot down, the attacks did not stop. A Japanese officer, standing in the rubble of Tokyo, whispered to his colleague, "They can lose planes by the dozens and not even feel it." The realization spread like a shadow across the Japanese high command. This was the moment of truth, the day Japan understood that it was no longer fighting an enemy of flesh and blood, but an enemy of steel and factories. Spirit, courage, and sacrifice all had their place. But against 100,000 planes a year, they were meaningless. Even hardened warriors, men who had sworn never to surrender, began to sense the futility. Diaries captured their despair. One airman wrote, "We go to the skies knowing we will not return. The enemy replaces what he loses. We cannot. It is not courage that will decide this war, but factories." By 1945, the skies over Japan left no doubt. Tokyo burned under firebombing raids, Osaka crumbled, and Nagoya fell to ashes. The industrial miracle of the United States was no longer just a rumor. It was death from above, delivered in waves so constant that resistance seemed absurd. The symbolic turning point was not one single raid or battle. It was the collective realization that Japan's warriors could not outfight America's machines. The day Japan learned America could build 100,000 planes in a year was the day it learned victory was impossible. The story of Japan's rise and fall in World War II is often told through the lens of battles: Pearl Harbor, Midway, Guadalcanal, and Iwo Jima. But behind every clash of ships and planes lay a deeper truth. The war was decided not only in the skies or on the seas, but in the factories and assembly lines thousands of miles away. For Japan, the revelation was bitter. In 1941, it was believed that courage, discipline, and the spirit of Bushido could compensate for industrial weakness. It was believed that America was decadent, soft, and unprepared. Pearl Harbor seemed to prove those beliefs true. But by 1944, the myth had collapsed. The empire that had once dominated Asia now faced a foe that could build nearly 100,000 planes in a single year. The consequences were stark. Japan's air arm was destroyed, its fleets left without cover, and its cities exposed to relentless bombing. Pilots wrote home of despair, officers whispered of futility, and civilians watched in fear as the skies filled with American bombers. It was not that Japanese soldiers had lost their bravery. It was that bravery alone could not stop an enemy that combined courage with an industrial capacity unmatched in human history. The Sherman tank, the Liberty ship, and the B-29 Superfortress, all of these were symbols of a larger truth. America had become the arsenal of democracy. Its ability to outproduce its enemies was not merely a military advantage. It was the decisive factor in a global war of attrition. Against 100,000 planes a year, neither spirit nor strategy could prevail. And yet, within this grim story lies a paradox. Japan had mocked America as weak, but what it discovered was a different kind of strength. The strength of a society that could turn its consumer economy into a war machine almost overnight. The same factories that once made cars and washing machines now made bombers and fighters. The same workers who once built typewriters now built machine guns. This adaptability, this unity of purpose, was America's secret weapon. For Japan, the day it learned that America could build 100,000 planes in a year was not marked by a single explosion, but by a dawning realization, a recognition that the war was unwinnable. It was the day hope began to fade, replaced by grim acceptance. The sleeping giant had awakened, and it would not be stopped. As we reflect on this moment, the lesson remains clear. Wars are not won by courage alone, nor by technology in isolation. They are won when a nation's will, resources, and industry combine into an unstoppable force. In World War II, that force was America's arsenal of democracy. But this is only part of the story. If Japan was stunned by America's aircraft production, Germany was equally shocked by another revelation: the pace at which American factories turned out bombers. At Ford's Willow Run plant, a new B-24 rolled off the line every 63 minutes. For German spies and leaders alike, it was a moment of disbelief, even despair. And so, our next story begins. How German spies reported in shock when Ford built a bomber every 63 minutes.